Alright, so in this next video what we're going to take a look at is a couple of different ways to select specific controls in our JavaFX applications and some of the different properties in CSS that we can actually apply to those controls. So we saw a little bit of this already. I set up this initial demo of some CSS, some styling by creating a label, just this one control, put that into the scene, and then go and get these style sheets for the scene and add to that this style.css file that we have, and then go through the usual process of setting up the stage and displaying that to the monitor or to the screen. And then in the CSS file that I created, I'm using a single selector for labels and then applying this single property, this FX text fill, to change the color of text to red. So the way that I've set this up right now, I'm going to just go ahead and take what I have and just make a new project and add some additional stuff to it. So kind of keep these separate, where we have this very simple demo and a more elaborate example to go with it. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file right here. For this one, I'll keep the name fairly simple. So I'll just call this style demo2.java. And then I'm just going to go ahead and take the code that I already have and move that into here. So one of the things that I should note immediately, in addition to the fact that I'll need to change the name, so I'll call this style demo2, I'm going to keep this line right here on 20. This can stay exactly the same because this is still going to go get the exact same resource, which is this style.css file. The only thing I'm really going to do now is just start modifying some of the content that's inside of this file. So essentially I'm going to add more CSS code to this. So the first thing I want to go ahead and do is make sure that I've brought in a couple more controls, because I want to go ahead and modify the style of a few other things besides just labels. So for this particular example, we're going to focus on the two other sort of simple controls that we've seen so far, which are buttons and text fields. So I'm going to go ahead and import each of those. So do our import javafx.scene.control.textfield, and then import javafx.scene.control.button. Okay. Then we'll go ahead and make one of each of these. So we'll go ahead and make a text field. Call this just text field. We'll do a new text field. And then our button, just call that button, is equal to a new button. And for this one, I'll just give it some kind of generic text like click me. Okay. The next thing I want to go ahead and do to make sure that we can actually put this into our scene, we'll need at least one container. So for this one, we'll just go ahead and use a VBox. So just go ahead and line up everything vertically. Make our VBox, call it VBox, be equal to a new VBox object. Give this something like 10 pixels of spacing between them, and then we'll just put in our label, text field, and button. And then for the scene itself, rather than making the label the root node, now that VBox will be the root node. And then from here we can go ahead and start adding some new style rules to this. So I'll go ahead and compile this real quick, mostly just to see what the dimensions for this look like. I think at the very least we probably need to make this a little bit longer now. So I'm going to move this to about 300 pixels. Let's take a quick look to see how this is displaying, make sure all the content is visible. So we'll compile that. And then go ahead and run it. Okay, yeah, so this is plenty long enough to be able to display each one of those three things. And we can see right now, since I'm still using the rule from the style sheet to make the text for labels red, we'll see that this is some text is still in red, but for the, say, the text field, if I put my name here, and if we look at the text inside the button, we'll see that neither of those is turning red because that rule, we've only selected labels for it. So we're going to close that, and now we'll take a look at this style sheet in a bit more detail. So the two things I mentioned before, we have first the selector, where we use a dot and the name of some kind of control that we want to use. Basically, it's the name of the class that corresponds to that control in all lowercase. So in this case, we're using the label class, and the name is label in all lowercase. And then we have a pair of curly braces to make up the body for one of our selections. And inside of there we put in a couple of properties. In this case I used FX text fill, and I'm changing the color to red. So this is the value that I give to that property. So we can also go ahead and do the same thing for each of these other two controls that I put in here. So I want to go ahead and get the name of the class, but I need to change the style a little bit to match the syntax that it's expecting for CSS. So again, we need that dot, so we use that dot notation to specify the name of a class for one of our controls. And then I need to go ahead and give it the name, but there's a particular way that it's expecting the name in CSS. So to give you an example of what I mean, do a text field, and the way that it is expecting it is the name, text, and field, each of those words separated by a hyphen and in all lowercase. So this is how we specify a text field in CSS. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and try to do the same thing. Be certain that this will actually work the way that I intend for it to. If it doesn't, this is a good opportunity to discuss something else regarding these rules, but if this does work the way that I hope it does, then maybe I'll save it for later. The other one that I want to focus on, though, is going to be the button. So in much the same way as our label, it's just the name in all lowercase. It's only one word, so we don't have to worry about any hyphens. I'll give it those curly braces. And then for this one, I'll go ahead and use that same rule. Okay, so I'll go ahead and try this. Primarily, I'm a little bit worried about whether or not text field will work the same way as label and button. If it doesn't, there's a quick workaround that I'll discuss for that one. Okay, so we'll go ahead and compile this and run it. Okay, so right now we can already see that this is some text and click me. Those are both in red, and I can already tell from the cursor that all the text inside of my text field is coming out in red, so that much is good. At some point a little bit later, I want to discuss one other point about text fields. I think it will become more apparent with some of the other rules that we get into. So in addition to FX text fill, I'll go through a couple of other properties that we can kind of manipulate or change up a little bit. A few interesting ones that I'll go through. There are many others that you could also explore, but some of them include things like the font family. To give you an example of this, usually you'd use a very specific kind of font, say maybe something like Times New Roman. You can also just use a very generic full family. So an example of that would be something like cursive. So I use this as an example since this is very distinct from the default font family. So I'm just going to go ahead and take that and apply that to each one of these. In addition to this, I also want to go ahead and test out the font size. So we'll go ahead and change that. So we'll go ahead and change this to something like, let's say 24. And the way that we specify a font size, we'll do the number, so the size that we want. And we also have to specify a unit, since in addition to pixels, there are a few other fonts that you could use. And then we'll go ahead and take that and apply that to all three of these. And then the last one I want to go ahead and use for this is going to be FX font weight. And for this one, this is basically what is used to determine if text should be bold or not. So the default is to make it normal. This just means non-bolded text. I'm going to go ahead and change this and make it bold. And I'm going to go ahead and take that and try to apply that to each of these as well. Okay. So we'll go ahead and compile it like this. Just run it. Oops. Okay, so we can see that it's all a little bit larger. It looks like the font family wasn't applied properly. I suppose that one's not actually recognized on this computer. Might be able to test something else, possibly monospace. I'll try that and then test it in a moment. And then we can also see that my name is also, at the very least, the size and the color have changed. And it looks like The weight is not being applied either. Another way that we could approach this is to just give it a number. Let's see if maybe that will resolve that problem. If not, it could just be that some of these style rules aren't being applied for one reason or another. Admittedly, one of the trickier parts about using CSS is that debugging becomes a bit more difficult, since there are no error warnings or anything like that to let you know what you've done wrong. Okay, so we'll try like that, see if that has any effect on it. Otherwise, I'm not going to worry too much about that part of it. Okay, so at the very least, we can see the monospace has taken effect. We can see that there's a very distinct difference in the text, and it also looks like me using the numeric value instead of just specifying it as bold has actually an effect on it as well, because it's a bit bolder now. Okay, so these are a couple of different ways that we can approach these style rules. All right. So the next thing to mention about this is that each time I've changed these style rules, you've noticed that I come over here to my terminal and I go ahead and compile and then rerun my program. But one of the really convenient things about the way that I'm approaching this is that I don't actually have to go through the compilation step every single time I change my CSS file. And the reason for that is because of the fact that whenever I go to run my file, this line right here, as I mentioned before, get class is going to check for the class at runtime, meaning that this entire thing is actually being handled at runtime, meaning that the entire resource is being fetched at runtime. So if I change everything that's in the CSS file and then I rerun the program, it's going to go ahead and grab whatever that new content is inside of that CSS file. So to give you an example of what I mean, if I take one of the lines in the CSS file and I remove them, say I change the font size back to its default, which is, I want to say 12 pixels, and then I just don't compile this again, I just run it again, we can actually see that this is some text. That label has actually changed, even though I didn't have to compile my Java file again. So that's one of the really convenient things about using CSS that way, is that if you need to continuously play around with the style to get it exactly the way that you want it to be, you don't have to keep compiling the Java program over and over again. You only have to rerun it. Okay. Another thing to note about the way that I've set up this CSS file, we can see that we have a bunch of rules or properties that I want to apply to a couple of different controls. It gets very repetitive the way that I'm approaching this, and ideally I'd like to try to find some way to be able to keep this program as concise as possible. Essentially, I want to be able to follow that dry principle of not repeating myself. This is very similar to when you're dealing with Java programming, finding ways to be able to reuse your code, things like loops, methods, classes. We want to be able to do something kind of similar with our CSS file. And one of the things that I can do is I can actually apply style to the entire program. So this affects every single control in that program. And the way that I do that is by specifying a kind of unique node that's associated with my application. So I mentioned before that at the very top of my scene, this control that I place right here, or this container that I place right here, this is going to be treated as the root node of the application. So I can actually get that by using the root. And this selector right here will actually apply any of its properties or any of its rules to everything in the application. So I can just go ahead and take everything that's right here and move that right here, and then I can remove all of these. And so now this will actually apply everything. And again, as I mentioned, because I'm only changing the CSS file and not the Java file, I can just go ahead and run this again without doing any recompilation. And now we can see that it's actually affecting everything again. Although one problem is with the text fill. If we test this, yeah. So FX text fill doesn't quite behave the same way as the others, and this is kind of the issue that I was worried about earlier. Okay. So to address that, I think now is a good opportunity to talk about this one. I'm going to go ahead and take this, And for the root node, this should work the same way as with individual controls, where I'm going to specify the root, and then I want to go ahead and specify the text inside of the root. The way that I'm doing this is basically saying that I have my root, there's a space, and then my text, and then my body. And this text is basically just going out and getting what are known as the text nodes inside of the root. This is a rather unique part of CSS. This isn't really covered in the book. It's mostly just something that I want to be able to address because of the fact that whenever you're trying to add some style to your applications, you might run into an issue like this. And I just want to very briefly address how to fix this. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this here, and this should still work the same way, where it'll affect every text node within the root. So that should cover everything. No, it doesn't work quite that way. I think for this one, you may have to just apply this to the individual ones. If that's the case, in addition to being able to specify the root node, another approach that you could take to be able to demonstrate using multiple different controls. So what I did right here, just to recap on this, was I'm trying to get the text nodes in the root node. It seems this is not quite what it was looking for. So another approach we could take is to just specify each one of the individual controls that I want to use. So in that case, there's a slightly different syntax for this, where I'm going to specify my label, and then I'll have a comma, and then my text field, and then another comma, and then my button. And so this will just affect all of my labels, text fields, and buttons. So this is essentially accomplishing the same thing as this, but doing it in a slightly different way. So internally it'll function a little bit differently, just to make sure that the text fill is being handled properly. So we try it like that. Then we can go and get our red text again. So that was another way that we could approach that. And it's also another way to make sure that we're not repeating ourselves. So I just essentially assign one rule to all three of these simultaneously, rather than breaking this up into 3 separate selections with 3 different instances of FX text fill. Okay. The next thing to mention is also going to be for the priority of rules. So if we're applying a bunch of rules to the root, the question then becomes, what happens if I want to make another rule exclusively for labels, where I specify that the font size should be something other than 24. Say maybe I want it to be more like 16 pixels. What's going to happen now? Because now I've specified font size as a rule in both the root and in individual labels. Well, if we run this, we can go ahead and take a look, and we'll see, compared to the text field and the button, this is some text. The label up here is a little bit smaller, indicating that this has been changed to that 16 pixels. So the way that this is going to work is that whenever we specify the same rule in 2 different kind of overlapping selections, whichever selection is more specific, that's the one that's going to take priority over the one that's more general. So in the case of the root, since the root happens to be the most general node that we could possibly specify, any rules inside of the root selection, those will always be overridden by any similar rules in the individual controls or any other selections that you happen to make. Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about is going to be the properties related to what is known as the border. So I've talked a little bit about spacing, which affects the individual elements inside of or internally to a particular container. I've also talked a little bit about padding, which affects the sort of outside of a particular container. And now I want to talk about border, which is kind of the space sort of in between those two things. Essentially, it's going to be an outline of sorts around a particular control or a particular container. So the first one I'll go ahead and do this with is the label. So I want to go ahead and actually apply a border to this. So the first thing I need to do is to change my border style. By default, the border style is none. As you can probably tell from all the applications we've used, they never had any kind of border around them. because it's not visible by default. So instead I'm going to change that to make it solid. I then want to go ahead and also give it a color. So we'll do FX border color, and I'm going to make it black. Alright, so we'll just do these two just so we're going to see a solid black border around our label. I'll go ahead and close this. Go ahead and clear this to make some room, and then just go ahead and run that. Okay, so we can see this very small border around our text. So if we try to apply a little bit of padding, let's take a look to see what sort of effect that has in relation to the border. So come back to Style Demo 2. I'm going to go ahead and add the insets class to this. So I'll do javafx.geometry.insets. And then right here, we'll just go ahead and do our label.setPadding. Do a new insets object. Let's just do 10 pixels of padding all around. Okay. And so now, because of the fact that I added a little bit of 2 new lines to my Java file, I need to actually recompile it. So go ahead and compile that, and then run it. And so now we can actually see this little bit of padding around the inside, so it's kind of pushed out the border and also moved the other elements out a little bit away from the label. So this is the general effect that padding has in relation to that border. Okay. Alright. So that kind of covers some of the general properties that I wanted to talk about. There are obviously many other properties besides just these that you could get into, but this is just a short list to go through initially. You can also take a look at any of the documentation for CSS in the Oracle Java docs. In that case, then they give you a much more exhaustive list of all of the different properties, as well as many of the different selectors that you can use. Speaking of selectors, another thing that I want to go ahead and address inside of this is going to be using selectors with custom classes. So what I want to go ahead and do is make a new custom class in my CSS file. So this is not going to be like a custom Java class. This is going to be like a custom styling class. And then I want to be able to take that custom styling class and actually use that on one of the individual controls in my application. So to do that, the first thing I want to go ahead and do is add some more labels to this. So say we have another label. For this one, to say this is some more text, and then a third label. Oops, equals new label. This is the last bit of text. Okay, and then we can go ahead and take these other 2 labels, make them label 2 and label 3. We'll add both of those to this VBox. And then if we take a quick look at this, the way that it's set up right now, we'll see that all 3 of them, they're going to have all of these properties right here from the root label, the 2 label selections. So if we compile this and run it, so we can see each one of these. Obviously the padding would be the one thing that they don't have in common, since I only added padding in the Java file to the first label. This last one's going off a little bit, so we'll increase the width a tiny bit. Bump this to 300 pixels. Okay, so the way this is right now, we see that all of the text, or all the properties that we've specified so far, are being applied to all 3 of the labels. So what I want to do is be able to take the set of rules that I have right now, but I want to try to apply some of these rules to only one of these labels at a time. So the way that I want to do that is to create a new custom class. So I'm going to call this essentially anything that I want. In this case, I'll call this unique label. So make up my own custom name for it, that pair of curly braces, and then inside of here I'll go ahead and specify another set of rules or set of properties with some values that I want to apply. So in this case, I want to go ahead and change this so that the font size, let's change the font color. So we'll do font fill, make that blue, and then I also want to do the border style, and I want to change this to, let's say, dotted. Okay, and then we're going to come back over to our Java file, and then right here I want to go ahead and add the class that I just made, that unique label class, to one of my controls. In this case I'll do this for label 3. So I'm going to do this underneath this part where I'd already set my style sheets for my scene. Admittedly, this line could go pretty much anywhere after I've already created my label, but just for consistency's sake, to kind of fit with the flow of the program, I'm going to do this after I've set the style sheets. It just seems like a more appropriate place to start setting up all of these style classes or anything else related to style for this, this application. So I'm going to grab that label 3, and then I need to use the getStyleClass method. So kind of similar to getStyleSheets. In this case, we're going to use this getStyleClass method to go grab the current style class that's being applied to label 3, and then we're just going to do a .add, and we're going to add to that the style class that we just made, which was unique label. Okay. So we have our little double quotes around that, and then specify as a string the unique label. So make sure that that name matches up. One thing to note is that I don't need to specify that dot as part of this, since anytime I specify a class from CSS, one of those style classes, that dot can just be inferred because it's always there. So we'll just leave that off. Okay. So I'll save that, and then we'll go ahead and compile this and run it, and we'll see what effect that has on our application. Okay, so at the very least, it did affect the border. So we changed the border to be dotted. It has not, however, affected the text, the color of it yet. Let's take a quick look, see if maybe there's a mistake on my part. Yeah, so this should be text fill rather than font fill. Okay. So we'll go ahead and make that little adjustment, close that. Since I only needed to fix the Java or the CSS file, we can just go ahead and run it again. Okay, so now we can see the overall effect. So in this case now we've changed the text color to blue, we've changed the border to be dotted. So one of the things that you might have noticed from the mistake that I happened to make was that since this rule was wrong, it just kind of stuck with this rule up here instead. So there's another thing about priority, what comes before what. Again, we got to focus on the more specific before we move to the more general. And whenever you make a custom class that you want to apply to, one or just a select handful of controls or containers in your application, that's always going to take precedence over the more general control selector for the whatever you're applying it to. So in this case, this unique label, this custom class that we made, will take precedence over the label selectors that we have right here. So anything that I put in here, we see is being applied instead of anything that was being applied from the two label selectors, like setting up the solid border or the red text. That's been replaced with a blue text and a dotted border instead. Okay. Alright, and then one last thing I want to cover for our selection properties is the ID. So the ID selector is a little bit distinct from the class selector in that the primary purpose of an ID selector is when you have a single element, whether that's a single control or a single container in your entire application that you want to be able to apply this style to. You should only ever use this ID selector on one single element in your application. But there's a bit of a catch with this, which is that your program isn't going to throw any kind of warnings or even break in any noticeable way if you don't do this. So it's really kind of up to you if you choose to use ID selectors to be consistent about it and make sure that you don't accidentally apply an ID selector to multiple different elements. Okay, so to demonstrate the way this looks, I'm just going to take this unique label and just modify this to be an ID selector instead. So the easiest way to tell is that you just remove the dot and replace that with this pound symbol or the hashtag. And so now this becomes an ID selector. So this is being used, we're applying the style to just one single control, so just a single label in the entire application. So we'll go ahead and save that. And then coming over here, I need to go ahead and modify line 36 here so that instead of setting up a style class, I'm setting up an ID for it. And to do that, all I need to do is just replace all of this code that I have here with set ID. Okay. And again, we don't have to specify that pound symbol at the beginning. Because this is an ID, every single ID selector always uses this symbol at the beginning. So again, it can just infer that that's what we're referring to, and we can just leave that symbol off. Okay. So the way that I've done this, I haven't really changed any of the style rules in any way. I'm just changing the way that I'm applying it. This won't have any noticeable change, or there won't be a noticeable difference to the application. So we'll go ahead and compile this, since I did have to change the Java code a little bit, and run it. And we'll see that it still has the same effect as before. Okay. Alright, so that's going to wrap up everything that I want to say about style properties and the different style selectors. For the next two videos, we'll go through a little bit about color properties specifically, since there are a couple of different ways that I want to talk about colors besides just what you've seen so far. And then the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is going to be inline rules, where we might be able to take a little bit of that CSS code that I've been showing in its own separate CSS file and maybe move that into the Java code directly.